As a quick reminder, in part 1 and 2 of this video series, I left Loch Tarbert and travelled to Eilean MacCormick at the entrance of Loch Sween. I spent the night in my inflatable cabin cruiser. The following morning I explored Loch Sween and the Fairy Isles, before crossing to the island of Jura. I then headed up the Sound of Eilean and spent the next night in Loch Tarbert, where I watched a lovely sunset before falling fast asleep. Once again I was up and about not long after the sun rose, and it was another glorious-looking morning. I headed for shore to have breakfast and refill my flask with hot coffee for later on in the day. I watched a boat arrive in its moorings. I knew it was Craig, and he always has time for a friendly chat. He lives on board the boat and is one of the gillies who look after his estate. It's always nice to know there's someone else around in such a remote location. We had a quick catch-up when he rowed ashore, but as it was a deer stalking time, he didn't stay long. Before heading off on foot across the moorland looking for the deer, I couldn't bring myself to mention that I knew there were some just behind the rocks in the opposite direction from where he was going. Simply because I know that he keeps in touch with his son, who also works in the estate and was guiding the shooting party who were looking for the herd. I guess I would have mentioned him if he had asked if I'd seen any, but as he didn't ask, I didn't offer. Or perhaps he knew we were there anyway. I also knew there were a couple of goats nearby, as I could smell them, but I don't think the shooting party are interested in goat meat. As Craig went his merry way, I got the drone out and let it have a fly about. Jura is famous for its raised beaches, which prove the land has risen well above sea levels of long ago. The cottages below belong to the estate and are kept locked except for the eastern end, which is Round Jura bothy and is always open so the public can use it. And when the drone came back, I headed over to the bothy for a look. I have camped here many times, but never fancied staying in the bothy. It's very much cleaner now than when I first came, and no sign of the rats that lived in it back then, but I still prefer my tents, or the inflatable cabin cruiser. Having satisfied my curiosity, I then made my way to the top of the hill, knowing I could get a phone signal there, so I could check the weather forecast. That's when I discovered I had an email from my brother Douglas. He had sent a photograph of a sunset I recognised and said, "Kayaking around Jura, wish you were here. Going to crew a bothy tonight." I smiled to myself thinking, surprise, surprise, I am here. No surprise you this evening. So my plan was now set. I was going to have a lazy day meandering around Loch Tarbert, chilling out on some beaches and towing a lure behind the boat in the hope of catching a tasty pink-fleshed fish. Then head for Crewe Bothy in the evening to catch up with my brother and down a few brew dogs. It was perfect sea conditions when I set off from Round Jura. I kept a careful eye on the depth sounder, as I find it best towing the lure in anything between 10 and 20 feet of water, so I'm never far from the shore. And it was a real pleasure for me watching the shoreline slowly pass by, as I recall previous memories walking a section of Loch Tarbert to explore the many caves. It was a heat wave back then too. It didn't take long to get a bite or three, but unfortunately the fish I caught were only watery-fleshed, tasteless pollock, so were put back to fight another day. Not that these fish give much of a fight. After a minute or two they seem to just give up and accept their fate. They weren't very big either, so nothing to write home about. I eventually stopped fishing when this old boy appeared and gave me a row for playing with his breakfast. Or at least I think that's what he said before he disappeared just as quickly as he appeared. I don't think this old fisherman was impressed by my actions either, so I put the rod away and left him to it as I headed further into the loch. I was in no hurry, so went into every nook and cranny along the northern shore, just to see possible places where I could moor the boat for overnight stays. Then, when I came to the narrows between the outer basin of Loch Tarbert and its middle basin, I started towing the lure again, as there was a bit more water flow in this area. I wondered if that would interest pink-fleshed fish. My guess was right, and after a few minutes I felt a good pull on the rod. Although, I confess, I silently cursed catching another pollock. However, as I reeled it in, I realised it was no pollock, as after a few minutes, instead of surrendering itself to me, it started putting up a good struggle. I was a little heavy-handed in the fish, so it jumped clean out the water and my heart skipped a beat. I instantly recognised it to be a lovely sea trout. I had been playing the fish for around 5 minutes before I started to worry and lose it. and not have any proof of my catch, so luckily I had the GoPro camera to hand and started filming. I wanted to capture its size and struggle should it escape. I knew I didn't have a landing net, so I also knew I had to exhaust the fish completely before trying to get it in the boat. Hopefully you can sense my concern watching the big fight. I didn't want it to jump again, so I was a bit more careful on how much tension I kept on it. I hope you can excuse seeing only the view of my back for the last of the fight, as I had only one thought in my mind now, to hopefully get the exhausted fish into the boat so I could murder it and then scoff its tasty pink flesh. The line was only 5-pound breaking strain, and I had a few knots in it, so I knew it could escape if the line broke trying to get out the water and into the boat. It struggled one last time when it saw me put my left hand under its belly and steadily pulled the line with my right hand. Then I breathed a sigh of relief when I flipped it into the air and it landed in the boat. Its hook came free as soon as it landed. However, it was too late for the fish. A sharp-pointed knife through its head ended its life as humanely as I could, and I had my fish lunch. I then landed immediately to pose with the kill and clean the carcass. There is no better tasting food in the world than scoffing a fresh sea trout, cooked before rigor mortis has set in, and while the adrenaline of the fight is still flowing through my veins. So the fish was filleted and fried in butter before scoffing. I guess the fish was not far off 3 pounds, and I ate half of it there and then. I did keep the tail half for my brother's supper, when we would meet later that evening. Full of fish, washed down with a brewdog, I then sat back and admired my surroundings. I felt at peace with the world, having just scoffed one of its gentler creatures. As I sat in the sun, too full of fish to move, I watched this little sandpiper go about its business feeding itself. It was only feet away from my own 2 feet. I think it knew I wasn't a threat, having just eaten my lunch. It was turning over stones looking for its favourite food, fresh sandhoppers. Yep, me I'll have to kill to eat. Even sausages don't grow on trees and come from killed pigs, so I'm no different from anyone else. When the drone returned, and as I wasn't far from Crube, I decided to head to the bothy and see if anyone was around. Unlike ruined Talon bothy, this one is in lovely condition and very bright and clean inside, so it can sometimes be busy with hill walkers. There were no sign of kayaks, so I knew my brother had not arrived, but checked it out anyway to see if anyone else was using it. It proved to be empty, so it looked like my brother and his friend Donny would have a room each, as there were 2 rooms in the bothy. I was happy enough sleeping in an inflatable cabin cruiser. The tide was full out now, so I could easily judge where to anchor so it didn't dry out in the low tide during the night. And as no one was here yet, I decided to pass some time going through a shallow, narrow channel to Loch Tarbert's inner basin. The channel is only a foot or so deep at low tide, and it's surrounded by weed beds just below the surface. So to assist navigation, the locals have erected marker beacons on the banks. The idea being, when the markers line up, you are above the deepest water. And it works well. I made the inner basin without incident. Once I reached the inner basin, there was nothing else to do but turn around and head back. I pulled over onto a sandbank to let the drone see how shallow the channel really is. Then I headed back to Crewe Bothy to see if my brother Douglas had arrived, passing a lovely sailing barge on the way. Sure enough, 2 kayaks outside the bothy indicated they had indeed arrived. I parked up and joined them for supper, and they enjoyed the other half of the sea trout while I enjoyed a few brew dogs. Then I headed back to the boat and slept the rest of the night away. It was an early start in the morning, as Douglas and Tony wanted to catch the last of the flooding tide into the inner basin. The plan was to portage the kayaks to Tarbert and from there paddle back to their cars at Carsig Bay in the mainland. My own plan for the day was to start heading for home, so I waited until the guys were on their way, then packed up my own boat and headed out of Loch Tarbert, turning north along the exposed western side of Jura. Initially it was a lovely calm morning, but the wind did start to rise a bit as I approached the Corrib Gap. Fortunately, it calmed down again before I reached the Great Race in the Whirlpool area. Crossing the Great Race, which was just starting in its ebb flow, so was pretty calm, I experienced one of those magical moments when a large pod of dolphins suddenly appeared and escorted me across towards Scarborough. Then, just as suddenly, they got bored of my company and headed off again. Once past Scarborough, I headed through the Grey Dogs, another gap between Scarborough and Lunga. The ebbing tide was now starting to pick up a little. From there I headed to Eilean. It was mobbed with spectators and participants for the World Stone Skimming Championship. And then it was just a short hop, skip and splash to my home port in Loch Tarbert. Another great multi-day adventure was over. Although the summer of 2024 proved poor for boating, I still managed to visit or round the small isles, Col, Guna and Tiree, Mull and the Treshnish Isles, Jura, Gia and Eilean. In fact, the only ones I missed were Ormsay and Colonsay, so they will be top of my list for 2025. I hope you enjoyed the videos, and thanks for watching. Plus a special thanks to all the people that have subscribed to the channel this year. I do appreciate it.